Okay, well, Joyce Carol Oates, what a way to finish here. And and someone got on my radar list because she's been here twice this morning, Emily Eakin, and she's with the New York Times, and she will be part of the conversation there. So I want to welcome you both.
Joyce Carol Oates. Is this better? All right. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank the Library of Congress, our wonderful host for this event. It's an extraordinary thing. Yes. And the way this will work, Joyce and I will talk for, I think, about 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. Your questions are much smarter than mine, so please formulate them, hang on to them, and we will call on you in a little while. So now for Joyce herself, where to begin? This being Joyce, she has 2 new books out, practically on the same day, I think in June, a collection of stories called Night Gaunts, and a novel that began as a short story, I think, called My Life as a Rat. And we'll talk about them both as a kind of, I think they work well as a prism into her fiction generally. Joyce has said, and I quote here, that she spends an inordinate amount of time doing nothing. But we know that's not true, right? She's written dozens of novels, perhaps 1,000 stories, at least 2 memoirs, plays, essays, lectures, and poems. She's won 2 O. Henry Awards, a National Book Award, the National Humanities Medal. She's a 5-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. And this year, Joyce, you're the winner of the Jerusalem Prize, which is awarded every 2 years to a writer who tackles the themes of human freedom. And I was looking at the list of previous winners, and I noticed you're only the 2nd woman after Susan Sontag to win this prize, and I'm not sure what that means. And I wanted to ask you, why is it that only 2 women have earned this distinction?
Well, I have no idea why anything takes place, actually, but I wouldn't presume to know. It's a prize given in Israel. It's given every other year. It's just probably an accident. You know.
Okay, well, Joyce, thank you for sort of path breaking here. Let's hope that other women are recognized for dealing with issues of human freedom in their writing. Joyce has also taught at Princeton since 1978 and is currently the Roger S. Berlin Class of 52 Professor Emerita in the Humanities. So when she's not writing, evidently she's sort of mainlining the infinite ways of being that are peculiar to our species. And I started to make a list of some of the issues and themes that have come up in her fiction, and that list included matricide, abortion, scientific misconduct, brain surgery, cancer, amnesia, sexual obsession, political assassination, murder, sexual abuse, serial killing, drug addiction, the supernatural, crime, drug addiction, racism. You can see that there's almost no point to continuing because this list quickly becomes absurd. We're basically summarizing the totality of human experience. So Joyce, how do you select from that universe? How do you conceive your subjects?
You left out writing about cats.
I left out.
Which I do a lot of on Twitter, in case there's anybody in the room who follows Twitter. I really don't know how to answer that. Basically, most writers and artists, I think, are quite immersed in one project at a time, and I don't have much sense of it, or I'm not really that interested in things that I've done in the past. It's more like the present project is very engrossing and challenging and frustrating and upsetting and depressing, and so each day has its own challenges. And what I'm working on now probably does have some relationship to things I've done in the past. I mean, I'm sure there's a kind of overlapping themes that kind of are braided together, which is true of most writers, I think. Obsessive compulsive themes that keep emerging.
Well, let's talk about My Life as a Rat, for example. Yes. So this novel began as a short story, and you returned to it and developed it into a novel. It's a novel about a murder and the repercussions that this murder, which is racially motivated, have on the murderer's family, and in particular, the murderer's sister, a young girl, Violet, who testifies against her brother and pays a steep price for it. Tell us about the genesis of this story and why you went back to it.
Well, there are many reasons why a person writes a novel. I think of the novel as like a large river, and there are many tributaries that flow into it. So at one point, when I wrote the short story, I was very interested in the theme of being disowned, which I've actually written about a couple of times, being disowned by a parent or by parents, and how it speaks to our great anxiety, I think, about being lost or being separated from the meaning and love in our lives. So I was probably thinking about that for some specific emotional reason at that time. And then after I wrote the short story, it appeared in Harper's Magazine, but it always seemed like it needed to be developed because many decades are kind of compressed into a short story form, and basically the novel would then open and develop the character who goes through, about 20 years of her life or so. So the short story was not really an ideal form for the theme. Then I was also thinking about, and this is a subject that interests me all the time, the ethical obligations that we have to our common weal, to other people, in contrast, sometimes contrary to family and tribal allegiances. So those questions, I think, are very much with us all the time. Do we have an ethical obligation to morality that's beyond just the family and loyalty to the family? Or is loyalty to the family something primal and elementary? So I was really thinking about those themes. Because I remember years ago, when the Unabomber was finally identified, it was because his brother was willing to come to the FBI. And at the time, the brother, I think, negotiated that the Unabomber would maybe not be executed. There was some sort of negotiation he had with the FBI. But some people thought that he was, quote, ratting on his brother. But I thought that was really unfair. I think that we have an ethical obligation to the common weal rather than just the commitment to blood loyalty or, your own family. And so,
especially maybe when it involves acts of violence, of harm to others.
Exactly, and things that might happen in the future. Yeah, so that seemed to me an ongoing theme that we were all sort of engaged with.
Now, in this book, as in many of your books, there is an act of violence at its center, and you're often described as a writer fixated on violence, or maybe I should rephrase that and say you're a writer accused of obsessing over violence, as if this is something really that should not be done. And you've even written an essay about this because you're so frequently asked, what is it with you and violence? But I think the question must be asked here. It does arise in this book, and I guess what I want to know is, what have you learned as a writer from investigating violence and its repercussions in a literary context?
Well, to sort of deconstruct your question, because it's a complex question, I think initially I felt that writers of some seriousness, who maybe in the past had been mostly men, because women were really expected to be writing about domestic scenes and situations. But a writer like Shakespeare or Melville or Dostoevsky, it probably wouldn't really occur to an interviewer to ask, like, why is your writing violent? Shakespeare would have said, well, I'm writing tragedy. How do you have a ritualistic tragedy without somebody getting killed? So the stage is almost, piled with corpses at the end of a traditional tragedy. But I don't think it would have occurred to anybody to ask most male writers why the writing is violent. they would just say, well, I'm holding a mirror up to reality, which is what Stendhal said. The novel is like a mirror moving along a roadway. And you must not accuse the author of creating the roadway because the world is what it is and the writer is reflecting it. It was always thought, though, I think for many centuries, that women had a particular focus on domestic life and family life and childbirth and childbearing and child raising, that there was something very special about that women should do and knew how to do a little better. But I think today that's all been really jettisoned.
Your writing seems to show that violence and the domestic sphere are not at all incompatible either. So.
Well, that's very true, but I don't necessarily write that much about a violent act. It's more like the consequences of violence and how there can be verbal violence, there can be psychological violence, emotional violence, and as well as the more obvious physical violence. So all these things, I think, are embedded in the concept of art, which is really based on conflict. You can't have any art without conflict. You have something like wallpaper, your impressionistic art, which is very beautiful, but somewhat, ahistorical and timeless. But if you're writing about drama, writing about people in conflict with one another, probably something has to happen that makes somebody unhappy.
So do you put yourself in the Stendhalian camp? Are you holding a mirror up to society, or are you fulfilling the needs of art for conflict, or are you doing both?
Well, I've always really been drawn to the realistic agenda in fiction, that art holds up a mirror to reality. And I think within that large agenda, the writer chooses the genre, the form, the style, what kind of language or vocabulary you're going to have. But that if you're committed to what I would call psychological realism, that's sort of the larger commitment, that that's a realism rather than a fairy tale or a fantasy. So that brings with it many aspects of life that are sometimes unpleasant, or we suffer each alone, or we die each alone. These are sort of primal facts that it's not helpful to pretend that they don't exist.
This is interesting to me because some critics have suggested that there's a tendency in your fiction for women, especially young women, to be victims often of male violence, and not just of male violence, but of others' moral turpitude, let's say, so that the ramifications that you're dealing with often feature, that there's a kind of Joyce Carol Oates typology. And I wonder what you would say to that, which is often voiced.
I guess I should just confess and admit that I'm the only person who's ever noticed that women and girls are sometimes victimized by men. I mean, I'm the first person, it doesn't exist in reality, only in my fiction. So I'll just confess to that. It's just a strange predilection. I don't know where I got it from.
It seems to be a predilection held against you, but it's interesting because in the collection Nightgaunts, there are some naive young women. I'm thinking particularly of the woman at the center of a fascinating story called The Experimental Subject, who is a young woman, very earnest, inexperienced, who's taken advantage of by an unscrupulous researcher and made the object or subject or both of a very unethical scientific experiment. And yet, in the same collection is another story featuring a just as innocent and inexperienced young man who is tormented by his Sunday school teacher into a kind of madness. This woman becomes obsessed with him. So there are, just to point out, there are male victims or men playing that role in your fiction on occasion.
Right. Well, I don't necessarily always think about gender. It's probably not the most interesting or obvious thing that one thinks about.
One of the things to note about that story about the young boy tormented by his Sunday school teacher, the sign of the beast, is that he has a birthmark on his face that the Sunday school teacher comments on relentlessly. And this is a source of embarrassment and shame for him. And this is also, I think, a recurring feature of your fiction. Often there are physical marks, deformities. In fact, that's not the only story in the collection in which there is a birthmark. The father in Night Gaunts has a mark on his face that becomes more inflamed as he becomes more and more increasingly ill and deranged. And I'm struck by that, and I wanted to ask you about the significance of those marks.
It's probably a residue of Gothic fiction, a sort of Hawthornian badge, the overt badge of some sort of inner conflict. But the Night Gaunts is a novella really about H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes.
You probably
yes.
noticed that. And so when I'm writing in a Gothic mode, I'm more likely to work with elements that are somewhat surreal. My Life as a Rat is a realistic novel. Most of the stories in Night Gaunts are surreal, and they move into another dimension of dream or hallucination or parable or dark fantasy. So it's a slightly different consciousness. And these genres, I think, are helpful if you're a reader. You know, if you're reading a mystery novel, a procedural thriller, a detective novel, you are probably reading a realistic portrayal of police work and the law and so forth. And the supernatural is not supposed to emerge in like procedural detective fiction. There's a sort of implicit contract with the reader in these certain genres. I would guess that a romance genre, there'll be some sort of happy ending. Can't imagine what that would be in a romance genre. And with Gothic fiction, there may be some resolution at the end because genre fiction often does have a resolution, but it will probably not be totally realistic. Then with mainstream fiction or literature, let's say, which is disparate as Joyce's Ulysses or Moby Dick, there's really no contract with the author. Any work of serious literature is somehow setting out to be unique, and it might have a happy ending, it may have an ending that's completely mysterious or irresolute. It may be like Joyce's Ulysses, where it gets increasingly difficult, and so that one is carried along with a kind of momentum to see what's the writer going to do next. But the genres, for some of us, the genre writing is exciting and exhilarating because you have essentially a form, and then it's like writing sonnets, where poets do write sonnets today, but they're not conventional. So you have a form, and you can sort of distort it or do interesting things with it.
So are you very conscious of genre when you sit down to write?
Absolutely.
I see. So you're working within
Yes.
self-imposed constraints in that sense. I mean, when you're writing an homage to H.P. Lovecraft, you're writing a Gothic story, not a work of realistic fiction. And
right. And there's still realistic elements, and it takes many of the elements and features of Lovecraft's actual life. And then by submerging myself in an imagined person who's Lovecraft, I'm trying to give animation to a very fevered and febrile imagination, which was Lovecraft, and sort of trying to give life to him. And it's like paying homage to him because he's really a sort of a special person.
Is he a big influence on your...
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. I read so much, you know. I have been literally around like for about 500 years. And I've been reading all these books. The first book I ever read, the first two books I ever read when I was 9 years old, was Alice in Wonderland and Alice in the Looking Glass by Joyce Carol. My grandmother, my Jewish grandmother, gave me this wonderful book. So this book has everything in it because it does have some residue of psychological realism, but it's very hallucinatory. It's just very, very imaginative. The books are like nightmares they're filled with all sorts of extraordinary things, plus a kind of ongoing debate of a kind with Darwinian evolutionary theory and the idea of the survival of the fittest and so forth. So when I read that, like at the age of 9, obviously I was just taking the very superficial meaning of Alice in Wonderland. But I subsequently reread the novel many times. I've even taught it at Princeton. So it's like everything is in that novel. There is realism, but it's mainly it's a so-called children's book. So it's in that realm where children's writing is not realistic. Children's writing is fantasy writing, but it's a very special kind of fantasy. In the history of our species, the first kinds of art tend to be childlike and fantastic and mythic, like cave drawings, you know? And it really takes centuries and centuries to develop what we call naturalism or realism in the 19th century. Because there's something about the human species, we don't really want to see a lot of reality. I think there's a feeling that things have to be sort of given coherence in a mythological structure. But by the time you get to the 20th century, or maybe the late 19th century, working with a very different way of looking at life, which is almost like raw realism, with focus on the physicality of life, which you don't find in earlier forms very much at all. And then in the 20th century, for women to be able to write about their own bodies, Virginia Woolf said she said, I could not write about the body. You know, there's no bodies in Virginia Woolf, and there are no bodies in Henry James. You look in vain for anything like people sweating or doing the things or even eating. I mean, people don't do any of those things. But then you come to Doris Lessing, the Golden Notebook, she's really, really writing about the physicality of being a woman. And for some people that was radical and repulsive and shocking. For other people, very liberating. So I've gone on too long.
No, this is fascinating. There are a lot of bodies in Joyce Carol Oates, and I want to get back to them because it's very interesting. They do seem sort of avenues into some other level of consciousness. The kind of deformities or marks in these bodies seem to point to sources of some psychic wounds or spiritual wounds or sexual shame often. And that's a really important topic, I think. One character in Night Gaunts talks about the combination of disgust and arousal that he feels. And I feel these sort of sensations that are provoked by the contemplation of a body are something you are concerned with. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm a storyteller, so the stories do involve people, but it's not necessarily myself, you know, they're all pretty mediated. So I'm interested in telling stories and finding the tropes and images that will tell the stories and finding the right voice. But, you know, there are certain things that are probably mythic or archetypal that writers are gravitating toward. You know, it's not necessarily that one feels personally that way. I think I have a somewhat philosophical or aesthetic attitude towards storytelling that I would like to tell. To me, as with Shakespeare, and by the way, I'm not aligning myself with Shakespeare, but probably I really identify with the idea of the dramatist who's displaying human personality in the extraordinary, astonishing varieties of human existence and personalities. So you have like a stage populated with people with different attitudes. So there is a story that would involve sexual shame. There's a story that would involve redemption, somebody suffering, but then, you know, overcoming it. And I would like to tell that story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I've invested my own self in any one of those characters.
Of course not. But yet, this is a reoccurring theme, I think, in the fiction, is a real serious investigation of erotic attraction and the sensations behind it. And that does seem to me really a distinctive motif in your work. And I don't know another writer who can simultaneously evoke both the kind of feelings of repulsion and attraction that it strikes me might really be what the erotic register
Let's see.
consists of.
Well, I don't know, maybe D.H. Lawrence. I mean, I'm probably not unique. It would really depend upon the work. You mentioned the experimental subject. That's a novella, really a long story novella that is in Night Gaunts. And to me, that was so exciting because I'm working with the idea of an experiment. And this experiment actually has been attempted and probably will be attempted again. It's mating a human being with a chimpanzee and seeing if you can get a
human Z, is that what they
a human Z. See if you can get that fetus and then this creature to live, because when different species mate, they can't reproduce. Now, from my own research into it, and I'm very interested in science, sort of the connection between science and storytelling, because really exciting experiments are like stories. The scientist says, what if, and then creates this experiment. And a brilliant scientist will create brilliant experiments. Sometimes it takes years to just set up the experiment. So I do know that I think a Russian scientist, maybe a Soviet scientist, did try that. He did try to mate these two.
How ethically did that work? Because that's the big moral question in this, or the moral grotesquerie in this short story is that there's a huge ethics violation in that the woman who's implanted with the sperm of a chimpanzee does not know this is happening to her.
She doesn't know about it.
So I'm fascinated that such an experiment was actually carried out.
Well, we don't know exactly because this person, I think, was exiled to Siberia. But there are all kinds of experiments that are going on right now. I mean, I'm just guessing, but I would guess, I'm just guessing, that maybe in another country where there aren't ethical restraints on scientists, just maybe possibly they're trying to transplant a human brain or a head. A brain. I would guess that's like the next thing, because if you're a scientist, you're always looking for the next thing. Who would have thought that you could have heart transplants? In the 19th century or other centuries, who would have thought you could have lung transplant, kidney transplant, all those procedures, bone marrow. Who would ever have thought that you could do that and the patient would live? So probably the next step would be transplanting a brain, and that I think cannot be done in North America. But there are other parts of the world where there are not these restraints. I was married for 10 years to a neuroscientist, and during those years, I did a lot of reading in science and also scientific misconduct, because my husband wrote a bit about scientific misconduct, which is unethical behavior. But if you go back in time, there were no constraints. Basically, scientists could do almost anything they could get away with. Scientists for the government could set off, say, atomic bomb experimentation, and having actual soldiers, like young soldiers, right near, not very far away from the radioactivity. That wasn't considered at that time probably misconduct because there weren't laws about it. Now there are laws about it. So in telling a story, I wanted to explore almost the very real elements of what that experiment would be and sort of look into it in almost a realistic way. If there were a realistic experiment, it would probably go along these lines. And I wanted to show, partly because I was married to a scientist and was quite aware of scientific literature. So the story is not a fantasy story of the kind that H.P. Lovecraft would write, where it's just completely fantastic. but more of a quasi-scientific story. So even though it touches upon the forbidden and the unlikely, at the same time, it would probably be, this would be the way it would go.
I wanted to ask you about your interest in science because it's quite evident that you have a strong interest in science. I wondered if you read scientific journals for fun, sounds like maybe you do. And at the same time, since we've talked about that, I want to talk a little bit about art because you've also evoked specific paintings and imagined the characters in them in other works of fiction. And I'm thinking of Edward Hopper, whose painting 11 a.m. is the subject of a short story in Night Gaunts. And you've written about a Balthus painting as well in another context. And so can you say a little bit about that?
Well, writers and poets have often, I think, been quite imaginatively stimulated by works of art. And so it's not that unusual. I have done a bit of that also in poetry as well. But somehow there's something about a beautiful painting, a mysterious painting that one wants to somehow bring it to life and give a kind of spiritual or psychological inwardness to characters who seem to be just maybe, 2 dimensions instead of give them 3 dimensions.
Well, we're going to turn to questions in just a minute, but before we get to questions, I want to talk more generally about your routine because people are so curious, Joyce, about how you do it. And I know you're asked this all the time, but satisfy our curiosity today. You've given interviews over the years, going back to the 70s, about your routine. I'm sure it may have changed over the years. You're now on Twitter. I think you have something like 200,000 followers. What do you get out of social media? How do you go about your day? Are you still jogging? What are you reading? All these questions. We all want to know. Do you write in longhand?
Well, it's hard to answer. There's sort of a flurry of questions.
Yes, you can pick the one you want.
One question is...
Let's talk about Twitter.
Well, Twitter is just sort of like something that's like the left hand or the left brain or something. Twitter is maybe the equivalent of writing little aphorisms or little flash fictions. And a lot of what I do on Twitter is cat pictures because many of the tweets that come out under my name are actually sent out by the cat. I have a cat. Cats take over in the nocturnal hours, and there's a sort of rich, hallucinatory, bizarre, lurid Twitter flying around during the night. That's because all the cats have taken over. So my cat is right in there. She's got this lurid imagination. People are laughing, but it really is a problem if you have a cat that insists upon taking over. And sometimes they get in your computer and change your writing and do things and change endings and so forth. It's actually not my fault that there's so much sexual repulsion. It's that cat. So, but one thing you mentioned a few minutes ago about the interest in science, I did write a novel a few years ago called The Man Without a Shadow, and that's based on the most famous amnesiac in the history of neuroscience, which he was known as HM. I mean, I know his name, I don't remember exactly what his name is, but he was always known as HM. So I was very interested in this phenomenon of a person who had brain damage, and he was not able to remember anything for more than 70 seconds. His long-term memory was all right. That would decay gradually, the way all of our memories decay. That was all right. His short-term memory was only 70 seconds. And so I was very fascinated. Suzanne Corkin at MIT, who was actually a friend of my husband, Charlie Gross's, she had written a book called Permanent Present Tense, the fascinating story of HM. She was obviously a woman neuroscientist who experimented with this amnesiac for like 30 years. And she worked with experiments to explore the nature of memory, which are quite fascinating. But so she got to know him very well, and I think she felt real affection for him. But every time he met her, like every time she came in the room, he'd never seen her before, over 30 years, because he had a very short-term memory. So I wanted to write about a woman who does fall in love with her experimental subject, which is in itself supposed to be unethical, but then she really reviews and loves him, and then he never can remember her, and it became almost like a parable of how we will continue, or should continue, to love people close to us who begin to forget us, or their memories are atrophying, or people who are ill, who are passing away from us even though they're still alive, but they're kind of moving in another dimension. That's the great drama of your life if you live long enough. So you're married, you're going to, and you may outlive your husband. It's going to be an experience where the personalities start to change. And how does one deal with that? And I felt I wanted to write about somebody who felt that love actually transcends the memory, so that you can continue, you find a way to love someone even though that person may not even remember you anymore, or the personality's changed. So that was very exciting to me, because it seemed to me a kind of writing that I hadn't really noticed anybody else doing, and particularly relevant to our time, where some people live to be quite old, and they have these illnesses, and people are taking care of them. So that was a novel that grew out of my relationship with my husband, Charlie, who was a neuroscientist, but definitely only because of that relationship. Whereas other writing that I've done, sprang from other sources, that was particularly the science, as you had mentioned that.
That's a very, very moving story. And the science as an allegory, really, for a kind of general human condition is really interesting. And on this note, we have to turn the floor over to questions. So please approach a microphone in one of the aisles if you would like to ask one, and we will call on you. It's hard for us to see up here, but let's start.
We have a question over here.
Okay, wherever. Go ahead.
I'm just going to casually say that you are one of my literary heroes, so thank you for being here. I'm right here. Hello.
Can you hear that?
Say that again. I think if I can.
I said I'm just going to casually say that you are one of my literary heroes, so thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's like a circle of hell. We can't see a thing. We can't see a thing. We're blind.
It's okay. My question is, for a writer who has an extraordinary body of work, and as a reader, I'm still over here. As a reader, it seems like you can do no wrong. I'm wondering, do you still have specific struggles when you sit at the page to write, whether it's on the level of craft, or I guess in more general, the level of being a writer?
I heard about every fourth syllable of that.
So is writing a struggle either at the level of craft, or when you sit down and just be a writer? Are there any issues with struggle?
Well, I mean, I hate to sound so personal or confessional. I'm really not in a great time in my own life right now, so I don't have a lot of energy. I don't have the sort of imaginative energy and ebullience that I have had in the past. So my concentration's very broken. I'm not really writing the way I would like to write. I feel like a snake with a broken back that's kind of crawling along, you know, and just sort of, the snake with a broken back, if you can get like this far, that's pretty good. So I probably don't have the same expectations of myself. But under ordinary, ideal circumstances, I get a lot of my ideas when I run. I try to run every day. It's like the one happy time in my life. And running up a country road and outside Princeton, up this hill, it's just really very exciting. And I will maybe get an idea for a chapter that I'm working on by that act of running. So when I come back to my desk, I can remember what I was thinking about. If I can't do that, my concentration is very broken. So I can look back upon my own self and see that at some point I was writing fairly rapidly. I could write a first draft. I can't really seem to do that now. So I'll just leave you with that image of the snake with the broken back, kind of just crawling along.
Oh. Over here.
Here.
Hi, I wanted to ask about one of your perhaps lesser discussed books, A Rape, a Love Story, which addresses in part the failure of the justice system and its re-traumatization of victims. In light of things like Me Too and Brett Kavanaugh, I was wondering if this novel has been one that you've reflected on.
Well, that is a novella that I really felt very passionately about. Obviously, it was written a long time ago, before the Me Too movement, but not before the era, which is ongoing, where women who've been assaulted and sexually humiliated and treated terribly, if they dared to bring charges against their assailants or their rapists, they were the ones who would be raked over mercilessly by defense attorneys, and situations almost literally unbelievable that women in the past had to contend with. Therefore, very few women would dare to say that they had been raped. I mean, the more research you do into this, the more outrageous it is. So Rape, a Love Story, takes place maybe, I don't remember exactly, 20 years ago or so. And another novel that deals with the same subject is We Were the Mulvaneys, where a girl, it's sort of date rape, and a girl she's very naive, she's never had any sexual experience at all, and she is gotten drunk by somebody, and she is raped. Then the consequences for her family and for the community and her going back to high school and so forth. But I felt very impassioned by that subject. Now the Me Too movement has come along subsequently. So there's much more consciousness now and much more generalized and articulate outrage. But in those days, people really kept quiet. And I think even now, less than 50% of rapes are reported, but probably in the past it was much, much less than that.
The next question.
Hi, I'm a writer myself, and I wanted to ask you that how much time does it take when you're having the idea to publishing it, and what's the difference of the time that it takes the shorter books to the longer books?
What is the time it takes for?
The short books and the long books, how much time does it take to complete a project? Is that the question? A novella, a novel, a short story?
She says yes.
Yes.
Well,
So it's about how much time you spend on different projects.
Well, obviously, I mean, you could sort of deduce that the answer would be it depends on the actual work, you know. War and Peace is a long novel, and so one would imagine it would take a little longer than The Great Gatsby, which is a short novel. So, I mean, some of this is what we might call common sense, and so common sense will answer.
Maybe it's worth adding, though, Joyce, because you have a reputation for such prolificness, is that you often talk about the amount of revision that you do. So it's not as if when you complete a draft, you send it off and it appears in print the next month, right? I mean, there's a lot of...
That's true. A long novel just demands a good deal of revision. Sometimes a short novel or a novella can be written with a certain swiftness and a momentum, almost like a short story, because ideally, that kind of writing should have a rather swift pacing to it. So sometimes you can write that more quickly and have a first draft. With a traditional novel that takes place over a period of time, you probably do divide it into sections and even decades, you know, so that there's a different, more leisurely momentum where you might work on a novel for several years, and therefore it would take longer. And you might do research for a novel, which if you're writing a short story or a novella, you might not feel that you need to do research. You're not going to have chapters with exposition or background and description because you want to move very swiftly along.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, and I
We have
think
one
I
last
see
one.
a figure over there on the right.
Hello. My name is Kathleen O'Neill, and your book, Blonde, has actually been on my to-read list for quite a while now. And I know it's about sort of the mythology that grew up around Marilyn Monroe. And I know that a lot of feminists of your generation, you know, Gloria Steinem and many women have written about Marilyn Monroe and are fascinated by her life and what that meant in reference to the culture. And so I thought I was going to ask you what exactly intrigued you as an individual about her, and also what kind of research did you do for writing this book about her life?
Well, let's see. That begins quite a long time ago. I was looking through a book in the library, sort of really accidentally, and I saw a photograph of a young girl, about 16, and she was a high school girl, and she had brunette hair and kind of a sweet face and a little upturned nose. And I was very surprised to see that this Norma Jean Baker, taken when she was, in fact, I think maybe a sophomore in high school. And she reminded me so much of maybe my own mother or girls with whom I went to school many, many years ago. She didn't look much like Marilyn Monroe. However, within 15 years or so, she would be world famous and she would be dead. I mean, it was a phenomenon that seemed almost quintessentially American. You know, you rise very rapidly from poverty and a very obscurity, like an impoverished background with a schizophrenic mother and no father at all, and rising very rapidly to a kind of notoriety and fame, but then also becoming extinct, as sort of like a species that has goes through its cycle very rapidly. So when I saw that was Norma Jean Baker, who became Marilyn Monroe, I was suffused with a great excitement about writing about Norma Jean Baker. And then the Marilyn Monroe character is one of her roles that she plays later on. She can do Marilyn Monroe, but she's always Norma Jean Baker. And she begins, in the novel, she really begins as a child with this schizophrenic mother that I mentioned. And sort of going through her life from the point of view of her being Norma Jean. I mean, that's who we all are, you know. Some people turn into a public figure, but you're always really your own self. So that's what excited me about it. Originally, it was going to be a postmodernist parable. It would end after about 150 pages when she gets her name, Marilyn Monroe, because that was a name given to her by the studio. And the novel was going to end at that point, but it was only like 150 pages. But when I got to that point, I thought, oh, I can't stop this because the great drama, the great tragedy, and the epic lies ahead. So I pushed forward, and I did a fair amount of research. Most of it was watching Norma Jean Baker and Marilyn Monroe in chronological order in Marilyn Monroe's films, seeing the development of a young actress. She's quite different in the beginning, and she evolves. She was actually a wonderful actress, and she was totally underestimated. She was held in a kind of contempt in Hollywood. She was considered like a B actress. People like Elizabeth Taylor or Olivia de Havilland, they were like the A actresses, and Marilyn Monroe was always sort of on this other level. She eventually made millions of dollars for other people, but didn't make all that much money for herself. So the more I learned about her, the more amazed I was and the more immersed to know that she died possibly of suicide. And when she died, she had so little money in the bank that her body was brought to the LA County morgue, not to a private funeral home, because there wasn't really enough money. Only because Joe DiMaggio, one of her husbands, stepped forward and provided money for her funeral. So I was always working with these profound ironies of how one of the most famous women in history would wind up so relatively poor that she would be in this in the morgue, where people were taking pictures of her body. To me, the ironies were fantastic because she's like Playboy woman of the century. So to be the woman of the century, but at the same time lying in a morgue slab and having your picture taken naked, how does that go together, and what does that say about being a woman? Those are the reasons that I wrote the novel.
Fascinating. Am I right, Joyce, that on Twitter I learned that Blonde is now going to be a film from Netflix?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Blonde is supposed to be developed for a film on Netflix. But I have to say that it had been under option for so long that any number of beautiful blonde young women, they came along and they were signed to do the role, but then they aged out.
But this time it may really happen.
One of them was Naomi Watts. Like it's like a kiss of death, you sign.
All right, well, on that note, we need to end. Thank you, Joyce Carol Oates, for speaking with us.